It's the 1970s. The world is at the peak of the Cold War. The Cuban Missile Crisis is way gone, but the tension between the West and the East is still there. While the US were busy in Vietnam, the Soviet Union was planning to make their dream come true. They wanted to build a fleet of aircraft carriers that could finally challenge the might of the US Navy on the world's oceans. But to realize this dream, they needed a special kind of jet, a revolutionary fighter that could leap off a ship's deck without a catapult. Their answer was the Yakovlev Yak-38, a vertical takeoff and landing fighter codenamed Forger by NATO. On paper, it was the Soviet Union's direct answer to the wildly successful British Harrier jump jet. In reality, it turned out to be a catastrophe of epic proportions. This aircraft was a fundamentally broken design from the moment it left the drawing board. But why did this fighter fail so badly? So badly that it became the first and the only operational Soviet VTOL jet ever. Let's find out. By the 1970s, the Soviet Navy was playing a desperate and expensive game of catch-up. While the US was sailing the seas with massive, floating air bases called super carriers, the Soviets were launching their first aircraft-carrying cruisers, the Kiev-class. These behemoths weren't true carriers in the American sense. They were strange, fascinating hybrids, part heavily armed missile cruiser, part carrier, with a bow packed to the gills with enormous anti-ship missiles and only a small, angled flight deck on the aft portion of the ship. Crucially, they had no steam catapults, the powerful steam-powered slingshots needed to launch conventional, high-performance jets. This single design feature created a huge, existential problem. The Soviet fleet had its powerful missiles, capable of threatening any ship in the world, but without proper fighter jets to provide air cover, these massive, high-value cruisers were just sitting ducks for Western naval aviation. Any F-14 Tomcat or A-7 Corsair could attack them with near impunity. The solution seemed obvious, staring them in the face from across the English Channel: a vertical takeoff and landing, or VTOL, aircraft. The British had already proven the concept worked wonders with the Hawker Siddeley Harrier, a nimble and effective strike jet that could operate from almost anywhere. The Kremlin saw the Harrier and essentially said, "We need one of those, and we need it yesterday." The Yakovlev Design Bureau, which had been toying with VTOL concepts for years, was given the monumental job. But the directive from the top was brutally clear. It was a frantic race against time. This intense political pressure forced a series of disastrous design choices that prioritized the speed of development above all else, ahead of performance, ahead of reliability, and even ahead of pilot safety. The goal wasn't to build the best VTOL jet. It was to build any VTOL jet that can operate, and do it quickly. This desperate rush set the stage for one of the biggest blunders in Soviet aviation history. At the very heart of the Yak-38's spectacular failure was its engine configuration. It was a complex, bizarre, and fundamentally flawed solution to the challenge of vertical flight. While the British Harrier used a single, brilliant Rolls-Royce Pegasus engine with 4 rotating nozzles to cleverly direct its thrust for both lift and forward flight, the Soviets went down a much different and much worse path. The Yak-38 was saddled with not 1, not 2, but 3 separate engines, creating an engineering nightmare. Here's how this convoluted mess worked. For normal forward flight, it had a single main lift/cruise engine, the Tumansky R-28, with 2 vectoring nozzles at the back that could rotate downwards to assist with lift. But that single engine alone wasn't nearly powerful enough to get the jet off the ground vertically. So, to solve this, engineers shoved 2 more jet engines, a pair of Rybinsk RD-38s, into the fuselage right behind the cockpit. Their one and only job was to fire up for a few seconds to provide vertical lift during takeoff and landing. For the rest of the flight, they were just dead weight, thousands of pounds of useless metal. This three-engine layout was a cascade of terrible ideas that dominoed into total system failure. First, it was incredibly inefficient. The two lift engines were notoriously thirsty, gulping down fuel at an alarming rate during the most critical phases of flight. In hot climates, where engine performance drops, the situation became critical. Some reports claimed the jet could burn through a significant portion of its fuel in as little as 15 minutes of VTOL operations. This single design choice crippled the Yak-38's range and endurance, making it almost useless for any real mission. Second, the sheer complexity was a maintenance nightmare. Servicing three engines instead of one made the Yak-38 notoriously unreliable and a Herculean task to keep flying. The engines were prone to unexpected failure and extremely sensitive to their environment, especially the salty, humid air at sea, which would corrode their components. This setup made the aircraft incredibly heavy and unbalanced. Those two extra lift jets were essentially a 7,000-pound penalty, adding huge weight that contributed absolutely nothing to the plane's performance once it was flying forward. This excessive weight killed the jet's agility, payload, and speed. Compared to the Harrier's elegant single-engine solution, the Yak-38 was a clumsy, over-engineered brute. The painful consequences of this deeply flawed design became tragically obvious when the Yak-38 officially entered service in 1976. Its performance was, to be gentle, abysmal. The very jet meant to defend the Soviet fleet could barely get off its own deck. In vertical takeoff mode, its official combat radius was often less than 100 miles. It was a carrier jet that couldn't stray far from its carrier, tethered by its own appalling inefficiency. This meant it could only provide a tiny defensive bubble around the fleet, not project power outwards. Its payload capacity was just as pathetic. The Yak-38 had 4 hardpoints under its wings, but in almost every operational scenario, 2 of them were taken up by external fuel tanks in a desperate attempt to go anywhere at all. This left it with a tiny weapons load, usually just unguided bombs, rocket pods, or a pair of early-generation R-60 air-to-air missiles, known to NATO as the AFID. It could barely fight its way out of a paper bag. And here's the absolute kicker. The Yak-38 had no radar. In an age where fighter combat was moving towards beyond visual range engagements with sophisticated missiles, the Forger was flying completely blind. Its primary job was to defend the fleet from attack, but it couldn't detect incoming enemy aircraft or missiles until they were already in visual range, by which point it would be far too late. The jet's many failures were put on full, embarrassing display during a combat trial in Afghanistan. The deployment was a total disaster. The hot, high-altitude air of the Afghan mountains was too thin for the already weak engines to handle, severely limiting payload and fuel. Even worse, when attempting a vertical takeoff, the jet's powerful downward thrust would kick up a massive, blinding cloud of dust, sand, and debris, which the engine intakes would promptly swallow. This foreign object, debris, would cause the engines to stall and fail catastrophically. The Soviet Union's premier carrier jet was utterly defeated by dust. After flying only a handful of useless sorties, the Yak-38s were quietly withdrawn. Beyond its awful performance as a weapon of war, the Yak-38 earned a much darker and more personal reputation among Soviet pilots. It was a death trap. It was also commonly known as the Dove of Peace because it spent more time on the ship than in the air. Out of just 231 aircraft built, a huge number were lost in accidents. At its worst, the accident rate was truly appalling, losing on average 1 aircraft per month. The 3-engine layout was a ticking time bomb, especially for the pilot. During the most vulnerable moments of flight, vertical takeoff and landing, the aircraft was balanced on 3 columns of searing jet exhaust. The failure of just one of those 2 forward lift jets was an instant death sentence. The sudden, catastrophic loss of thrust would flip the aircraft into an unrecoverable roll, giving the pilot absolutely no time to react before the plane was upside down and plummeting towards the deck or the sea. In what was a stunning and almost unheard-of admission of the plane's deep flaws, Soviet engineers installed a fully automatic ejection system. The SKEM system was designed to detect a rapid, uncontrolled roll or a critical engine failure and automatically eject the pilot, sometimes before they were even consciously aware that something was wrong. But this complex system had its own appalling flaws. There were numerous reports of it being overly sensitive and malfunctioning, sometimes triggering during an aggressive turn or for no discernible reason at all, violently throwing a pilot out of a perfectly good aircraft. Pilots were trapped in an impossible dilemma: fear the jet's faulty engines or fear the faulty system designed to save them from it. Its flight characteristics were atrocious, with some pilots claiming it had a slower turn rate than a World War II bomber. Essentially, flying the Yak-38 turned into a constant gamble with your life. So, in 1991, the Yak-38 was officially retired, its service life ending with a quiet, unceremonious whimper as the Soviet Union itself collapsed. An upgraded version, the Yak-38M, had been introduced in 1985 with slightly more powerful engines and other minor improvements. But it was just a futile attempt to correct the irreparable. The core flaws were too deep, too integral to the airframe, to ever be fixed. But the story doesn't quite end there in the scrap heap of history. For all of its catastrophic failings, the Yak-38 was a crucial, if incredibly painful, learning experience for Soviet designers. The hard, often fatal lessons learned from its disastrous life directly influenced its planned successor, the Yakovlev Yak-141. Conceived in the mid-1970s as a direct replacement, the Yak-141 was everything the Yak-38 was not. It was a supersonic, radar-equipped, and far more capable fighter that finally promised to give the Soviet Navy a world-class VTOL aircraft that could actually rival Western designs. It featured a powerful main engine with a swiveling nozzle combined with 2 smaller, lighter lift jets, a much more refined version of the Yak-38's concept. The Yak-141, codenamed Freestyle by NATO, set multiple world records for VTOL aircraft before its own program was tragically cancelled due to a lack of funding after the fall of the USSR. But in a bizarre twist of fate, the American aerospace giant Lockheed would later enter into a partnership with Yakovlev in the 1990s. Lockheed, which was deep in the development of its own VTOL jet for the Joint Strike Fighter program, the X-35, gained valuable flight test data and technical insights from the Yak-141's advanced propulsion system, particularly its unique swiveling rear nozzle. Aspects of that design would eventually find their way into the F-35B Lightning II, the most advanced VTOL fighter in the world today. So, while the Yak-38 itself was an undeniable failure, its legacy is a complicated one. And it proved, through its endless list of problems, that a simple, elegant solution like the Harrier is always better than brute force complexity. The Yak-38 was built all wrong, but the expensive and dangerous lessons it taught helped pave the way, however indirectly, for the future of vertical flight. If you enjoyed this deep dive into military hardware and its hidden stories, make sure to subscribe and hit the notification bell for our next video. And let us know in the comments what other famous military failures you'd like to see us cover. Thanks for watching. Goodbye.